here with Simon Cross for this tied webinar for the 2018 and 2019 ICT and support staff cohort. So welcome everybody. I'll leave you with Simon in a moment. So Simon's going to talk to us about assessment in distance learning, process, practice, experience, analytics and innovation. So I'll pass over to Simon now and I'll see you all later. Thank you.
Great. Well, hello there. It's great to have been invited to present to you today, and I'm aware that many of you will be listening to this on the recording. I'm a lecturer at the Open University, based in the Institute of Educational Technology, and I've been working and involved with assessment now for some 10 years or so. Working on a whole range of different aspects of assessment, some of which I would like to share with you today. I've also been involved with learning design work and with quality assurance and enhancement at the university. And currently I'm working on the TESS India project, which is looking at teacher education in India, and has over the last 4 years been developing open educational resources to support teacher education. And also we have run some very successful MOOCs on that subject. So welcome. And today, as Beck has said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about assessment in distance learning, some reflections on some of the approaches and some of the work that we've been doing at the Open University in the UK to enhance and to improve the process of assessment, as well as the pedagogies of assessment. And of course, sometimes when one thinks about assessment, one thinks about summative assessment, so examinations, those sorts of things, assessments that carry credit, and also formative assessment, so the type of assessment that's provided to learners for support and for feedback. And of course, assessment is also a process. To make assessment work, one needs to think about assessment design, how you integrate it into your learning design and into your teaching. You have the administration of assessment, and also the processes of ensuring that that assessment meets sufficient quality standards. So just moving on to the second slide now. I just wanted to just point out where we are in the country. I always find it nice to sort of know where people are talking from. So the little red dot here is Milton Keynes. So we're pretty much smack in the middle of the UK, about an hour outside London. So that's where I'm talking to you from today. So in this presentation, I'd like to talk about 6 things, and I'll touch upon all of them. The first one is just a broad introduction to how we do assessment at the Open University. Obviously, we've been doing distance learning now for 40 years, and the types and forms of assessment have been evolving over those times, and our legacy from when we used to teach at a distance with paper books, and learners would send their submissions through in the post. And over the last 15 years or so, of course, we've moved online, and our assessment processes has also moved into the digital domain. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about work we did about 4 or 5 years ago, looking at assessment practices and trying to benchmark how we do assessment to other universities, both in the UK and in Europe. Then to go on to talk a little bit about what we've been doing around assessing student experiences of assessment, to touch upon interpreting assessment analytics, which is a relatively new field and something which we're still doing quite a lot of work on at the university. But thinking about how we use the data that we're gathering from the assessment process to help us support in a similar way as learning analytics are used to help us support learners, and to identify where they maybe need additional interventions. And then briefly move on to talk about work we've been doing recently around verifying identity online, and how we know that the learners who are submitting the assignments at a distance are who say they are. And finally touch a little bit upon recent work we've been doing around digital badges, which is an example, I think, of innovating assessment. So moving on, one of the things that we found a couple of years ago when we were doing a major piece of work, producing a white paper here at the Open University, was that changing current practice is needed, with many commentators arguing that such change must be accompanied with a greater emphasis on pedagogically driven models for e-assessment. These facilitate the blending of e-assessment and e-feedback, very important, that second one, e-feedback, into a holistic dialogue learning framework. So at the Open University, we have essentially two types of assessment. We have an assessment which takes place at the end of a module, and we have assessments dispersed during the study of that course. It's a fairly conventional structure, but what we therefore have is we have a module which maybe lasts 9 months in total, which is worth the equivalent to 60 credits. And within that, there may be 5 or 6 or 7 assessment points occurring between every 6 or 8 weeks. And we call those TMAs, which stands for Tutor Marked Assessment. And what happens with those is that the student submits those to their tutor. Students are organised into tutor groups of around 15 to 20 students. The tutor will then mark those within 2 weeks and return that marked assessment to the learner with a score and with formative feedback, both usually on the script but also a summary. And that is now managed by an online digital assessment system. So we have many hundreds of thousands of assessments going through that system every year. And students can upload that to that. The tutors can then download the assessments, mark them, upload them back again, and pass them back to the learner. So that's the TMAs, that's the assessment points that happen during the module, and they have two roles. They first of all provide a score, which essentially contributes to the mark that the learner gets at the end of the module, but it also gives us an opportunity regularly to have contact with the learner and to provide feedback and to identify any particular learning needs. And that's something which, if there are particular issues or if the student wants to come back, they can have that conversation with their tutor in an ongoing basis. And of course, we have the other element of the assessment, the summative assessment, which takes place at the end. That can be an examination, which is usually a SAT examination in an exam hall, and we have a number of exam halls around the country where those and elsewhere for many courses. And the learner basically goes along to there. We're currently exploring about how we may be able to do that online rather than necessarily having the learner having to come to an examination room. The second type of assessment is what we call an EMA, which stands for End of Module Assessment. And this is usually a piece of coursework or a report or an investigation or a study. So it's a larger piece of written work which is sent to other markers, not to the tutor necessarily, to be assessed. And then the score that they get contributes in a similar way to the examination. Of course, what we have, we allow the learners who are doing examinations to have a revision period before the examination. That can be between 2-4 weeks sometimes. And then with our distance learners who are usually studying a qualification, either 1 or 2 modules at a time, there will be a break of a couple of months in the year before they then begin the next module. And what we have in this process, as is indicated by the arrow towards the top, labeled SEAM survey, is at the very end of every module, we undertake a survey that all students are invited to respond to. And this helps us get a lot of insight into the students' experience of that module. And that's called the SEAM survey. That stands for the students' experience of a module. That takes place just before the examinations, usually, or at the early stages when their students are completing their EMAs. So that broad structure has been the approach the university has used over the last 40 years. In recent years, there have been a number of experimentations and developments and flexes around that structure in particular modules and for particular qualifications. Of course, those that are maybe facing particular subjects or particular practice-based subjects will maybe be adopting a slightly different approach, but that's broadly how assessment is conceived. So, as I mentioned, we have a number of different assessment methods that the university uses, and that ranges hugely between subjects. So we have the conventional essays, reports, pieces of reflective writing. We also have for certain modules design studios or e-portfolios, if you like, where students can upload work to create a kind of portfolio. There have also been experimentations with using video, with PowerPoint presentations, with video, all those kinds of things. But there are a huge range of different various assessment methods, and often the challenge of those is to work out how to integrate them into our current method of managing assessment, which is this system which I described earlier. In addition, we are increasingly utilising functionality within our VLE, which is Moodle, and those, for example, are using the quiz options for formative learning within modules, but also sometimes for assessment that carries some marks that contribute to the final grade. What we have developed over the years is a process where we focus on certainly for formative assessment, we focus on providing the student with as much feedback as possible. So if it's a multiple choice quiz, if the student chooses the wrong answer, they will be given a piece of feedback and then invited to try again. So learners perhaps will maybe have 3 attempts at this, and at each stage there'll be an increasing level of feedback to help support them in making the right choice. But in doing that in a way that helps them to understand the mistake or the misconception that they've had, and how that can potentially be resolved by using that method. Now, as I also mentioned, one of the key elements of our TMA, so our tutor marked assessment, is this aspect of feedback and feed forward, and in particular feed forward. So whilst a student will be getting feedback on how well they've done on that particular piece of assessment, the intention of that is to provide them with information and guidance that they can take forward into their next assignment and into their next unit of study within that module or beyond. Okay, so just to give a very quick idea about where assessment fits into our VLE. Within our VLE, we have a week-by-week study planner, and within that, what we have is the assessment points highlighted and indicated to learners. So the weeks where there is an assessment, we have those marked up in gold, as you can see in week 11 here in the slide. And there's also a piece of information on that week, as you can see in the gold box, which flags up to the student that there is an assessment, which assessment it is, and what the deadline is. This is to help integrate assessment into the learning experience. We also have a page where learners are able to view the results of each of their assessments and to download feedback. And that's part of our VLE. Of course, each module has its own assessment guide, which is a very thorough description of the assessment process and also guidance on each of the assignments. So, moving on. At the beginning, I said I wanted to talk to you about a few of the activities that we've been doing here at the university around looking at how we do assessment. One very important piece of work we did a number of years ago was attempting to benchmark our practice against the rest of the industry. And this quote here, I think, from Antry is really interesting, in the sense that if we wish to discover the truth about an educational system, we must look into its assessment procedures. So here, this is very much about how we do assessment. And as this next slide shows, there are a number of different elements to this system. Here we've got 8 represented. So to make assessment happen, one has the strategy, the policy, and the expectations. That's institutional policy, top left. Then we have assessment development below that, which is to do with the course design and this course process, and then also the teaching, the teacher activity while the course is being taught. And then monitoring the evaluation processes around that. But then also, as you can see on the right-hand side, we have these quality assurance processes. So we have checking good practice, so student guideline support and communication. So making sure students are very clear what assessment they're expected to do and how that will be assessed. Also, staff guidelines and standards. So staff are very clear about how they can support students and also the standards that are expected of that assessment. And then alongside those and working interleave with those are an assessment base of good practice and of templates that staff can draw upon. And we, for a number of years now, have what we call an assessment hub, which pulls together a lot of the policy, a lot of the examples of good practice and the work that's going on in the university into one place for staff. And then finally, there's an element of the assessment process which is really just associated with staff training and support. That's a very important element, especially as assessment practices, just as all teaching practices are accelerating at an increasing rate. So what we did when we were looking at the benchmarking was to identify. We looked at a number of other benchmarks, e-assessment benchmarks, and also e-learning benchmarks, and we compiled a list of 99 different statements relating to assessment process and practice. In the previous slide, which I'll just quickly jump back to, there is a link which, if you're interested in more, you can find our paper on the university's website. And what we did here was try to sort of bring all these things together into one holistic checklist, if you like, the kind of things that should be going on in respect to assessment at the university. That's in respect to the teaching, also in terms of the organisation of assessment. And one thing I noticed that we currently don't have many participants in the room, but one thing that I was going to ask you to do was to spend a couple of minutes reflecting on how you would rate your institution against some of these criteria. So on this slide, I've outlined a number of these, and for those who are listening back on this, I would invite you maybe to spend a minute or two, possibly pause me talking, and think about how you would rate the institution that you're working at. Would you agree with these statements? Would you agree somewhat? Would you neither agree or disagree? Would you somewhat disagree, or would you disagree? What we did at the Open University is that we sent out a reduced number of these 99. I think there were around 30, 35 in total. And we sent these around as a staff survey, and we invited staff to feed back to us about whether they agreed or disagreed that the university was doing this at the moment. And the purpose for that was so we could identify where we had good practice, where there were good processes and systems in place, and where there were potentials for improvement. Where at the moment maybe we were missing a trick, maybe there were elements of good practice in some areas but not in others. So this was a really important piece of work for us to do to help us get a steer as to what we needed to do next in assessment. So I'll move on from that and just summarize that in pointing out the fact that there were these 5 elements, I think. So assessment knowledge and practice in this sort of community works in these areas. So we have teaching practices, we have design practices and assessment design, we have the element of professional development that I mentioned earlier, the importance of the assessment tools and technology, about getting those right and making sure those are integrated into the rest of the system, and the importance of having clear strategic policy processes and procedures in place that help frame and inform these other practices. So from that piece of work, a number of other very important pieces of work have happened at the university over the last few years. And one of the things that we identified is that we needed to understand more about the learner perspective, how learners were experiencing assessment, in particular how they were experiencing not just the formative assessment, those TMAs, but also how they were experiencing the summative assessment. So what was their experience of the examinations? What were their experiences of revision? How much support were they getting in the revision process? Which I think is a really interesting area, because we often will spend a lot of time designing the learning for a module itself, but we don't spend as much time thinking about how we would design the revision phase, how we would support learners at a distance. So those learners who are studying at a distance, how we help them to revise for the examination. So our benchmarking process highlighted this, and we then had a number of projects over the next couple of years looking at the learner experience. And of course, there are observational studies that can be done, questionnaire surveys, of which we did run one. We can look at analytics data, so the data that one gets back from the system about when students submit their assignments. One can undertake interviews. We did a number of those, and also collect that whole sort of grey area of evidence around and anecdotal evidence around how tutors and how students feel assessment is going. So, very briefly, and more information of this is available online, and I'm happy to provide further information as well. But we sent out this student survey, asking them a series of questions about a whole range of different types of the assessment experience. So here, for example, on this slide, we were asking about this is the question about question and mark quality. So were questions clear and well written? Were questions well aligned with the content of the unit or the module? Did the learner feel they were able to demonstrate what they had learned, i.e. that the questions were fair? Did the learner feel that the questions were harder than those that they were expecting? And were they satisfied with the marks they received? So we have a whole bank of these questions, and we've done quite a lot of analysis across these to discover new insight into how learners experience assessment. This slide is a second example, which looks at feedback and collaboration. Was the feedback I received helpful? Did they feel that they had used the feedback again in writing the next assessment? That's a very important thing that we wanted to learn. Was the feedback we were providing being used, and was it being effective? Were they satisfied with the quality of the feedback they were getting from the tutor? And also a question here about whether they felt that they would like to see more collaborative or group working activities. This is a perennial question in respect to how much group working and collaboration we expect learners to do, and how much we give them that as an option. So from this, one can do a range of analysis. The link on this slide will take you to a presentation that we delivered a couple of years ago at a conference in Spain. One can see the relationships, for example, between different elements of the revision part of learning and the examination itself. So here we have some moderate statistical correlations between elements such as a student being clear about what and how they were to revise, and feeling prepared on the day of the examination. Of course, what we're interested in here in this piece of work was to ensure that students felt prepared and comfortable in the very challenging and often quite intimidating examination conditions. And we were thinking and looking at whether there was something we could do in terms of revision support that would help make that experience of examinations easier. So, in conclusion, we analysed several hundred open comments from students, and also from the interviews that we did with students, and we found a range of suggestions. I'm sharing some of these with you in the next couple of slides. You may want to pause these if I move through them too quickly, and also to reflect on what issues you think that staff at your institutions would raise. And I'd be fascinated to learn if some of these that I have here resonate with you, or if there are some very different issues that you would anticipate would be raised by your learners. So in our case at the Open University, there were some issues, for example, around consistency between tutors on different modules, that students felt that feedback should help them moving forward, as I mentioned earlier, that there needs to be a timely release of marks. So we do that within 2 weeks, and that's intentionally done in a fairly short turnaround. So learners haven't forgotten what they've learned, and that those marks actually have some value in what they're doing next. And things like around the quality of question wording, and some concerns about collaboration or cheating. Those are some of the issues that came up around the in-course assessments, issues that came up around revision. Again, in turns included, and very importantly included, just getting previous specimen exam papers, getting worked examples of examination papers, mock exams, and the sample of marking schemas. And that's something which we still don't do as widespread practice, but is being done by many or some other universities, in the sense that you more clearly show how you plan to mark the examination, and that helps the learner to understand where they can get marks, where they may be losing marks, and helps them to appreciate the process from the marker side as well, which many learners find very helpful. Some other things, such as having good revision lectures, being clear about how much tutor contact a learner might get in that revision phase, how much they can rely on that support. Other things, such as making sure that examination skills and revision skills are taught throughout the module. So not just in the couple of weeks before the examination, but students are given practice at examination type questions or examination type conditions at a number of points over the 9 months of the course. So that's the learner perspective, and we continue to do a lot of work on that. And this is in addition to the data, the very rich data set that we get from our end of module surveys. We have about, I think it's probably about 20,000 responses to that end of module survey every year. And those responses, both the closed question responses and open question responses, are sent to all module chairs for analysis, and also are analysed by the qualification. And of course, some of those questions and some of those comments include feedback on assessment. So moving on from the learner's perspective, and just sort of sitting back and thinking about how we observe assessment as it's actually happening. One of the things that the university has been looking at a lot in the last few years has been learning analytics, about how we can use data that we collect from learner behaviour online to identify learners who are struggling or learners who need more support, and also to understand where we can improve the teaching or improve the content of modules. So we have a lot of work going on in this field, and I would really encourage you to Google learning analytics at the Open University to get a sense of what's going on in that space. And I appreciate this might not be the kind of data that you have available at the moment, or that you have the capacity necessarily to analyse. But I just wanted to flag this up because there have been quite a lot of work going on in this space, and in terms of the use of VLEs, sooner or later one will begin to be interested in all that rich data that one's capturing about learner behaviours and how one can make some use of that. Now, in respect to assessment, I call these assessment analytics, if you like. This is data that relates directly to the behaviour of learners around the submissions of assessment, and also the use of assessment feedback. So as I mentioned, we can get some information from student surveys, but we also have a lot of information that the system captures about submission rates and submission times, because every learner has to submit their assignment online. They also then have to download the feedback later on. So we have a log of all that. And what module teams find very useful is to look at the proportion of learners who are submitting assessments through the module, because there are these 5 or 6 different points through the module at which learners submit these, and one can look at the proportion who are submitting to get an idea of retention rates. So, for example, if there's a drop between 2 points, so between the second and the third assessment, where a proportion of learners don't seem to submit that third assessment, that could indicate that there's a particular issue with that that element of the module. And the module team could then go back and look at how that's being taught and whether there are particular difficulties in that area. So it does provide a useful tool to be able to identify where in a module there might be an issue. Looking at assessment submission times can also be quite useful to see whether a student is submitting before the deadline, on the deadline, or after the deadline. And when combined with other pieces of analytic data, can be useful and used to flag learners who maybe are struggling. So there are particular patterns of study behaviour that maybe would maybe flag that a tutor maybe needed to get into contact with that learner, that they maybe needed to keep a bit more of an eye on how they're getting on at that particular place in the course. And of course, we have other elements of VLE feedback. One of the really interesting things we're trying at the moment is what we call real-time feedback. So rather than relying on a survey at the end of the module, what we do is we ask learners about their experience during the module or about a particular element of that module. And that basically is in the form of a quiz kind of survey, but that data is intended to immediately provide the module team with information about how well the cohort is doing. So we call that real-time feedback, and that's something which we've introduced in the last couple of years as well. And what I also just wanted to pick up a little bit on was that last point on that slide, which was learning trajectories. And this is again just to make you aware of some of the things happening certainly in the UK, that there's been lots of discussion recently about this term called learning gains. Basically, again, this builds on this concept of analytics, but it's also coming from a policy perspective, with the government keen to try to measure how much value higher education gives to the learner, who essentially is conceived as that sort of paying customer, if you like. So alongside analysing for retention, for support and for feedback, as I've mentioned, we've also been trying to work out whether there is a way and how effective that way could be of measuring gain. And to cut a fairly long story short, it is very difficult because of the nature of the type of learning that happens at higher education, and also the ability to be able to effectively capture that. So one of the projects that we've been involved with for the last couple of years, with some funding from a UK funding body, has been looking at how do students understand and interpret learning gains, and what the relationship is between the scores that we measure, so the marks that learners are getting, and their perception of progress and gain. So I don't want to dwell too much on the particular issue of learning gain, but I think some of the findings from this project are really interesting, because we undertook a series of semi-structured interviews. We asked students about how they perceived gain and progress. So what did gain and progress mean to them as they were studying their undergraduate course? We asked them about cognitive, behavioural and affective change that they were experiencing, this relationship between progress and the grades they were getting, and also about the study expectations and the work relevancy of the learning that they were receiving. And we got some really interesting results. And some of the emerging themes around this relate to having different views of the meaning of assessment depending on which level of study, so whether they're first years, second years or third years. Also in terms of the relative value of grades changes as they move through their 3 years. And as this changes, there is also a sense of a change of ownership of the learning. So early on, when they're in their first year, learners feel as if they're having to perform and to complete assessment for their tutor, essentially with a slightly more extrinsic motivation. But as they begin to move further and develop and mature as higher education learners, they begin to see the value themselves in this assessment, and there's a shift there with the learners wanting to take more ownership of that and to do well in the assessments, or to complete assessments in a particular way that has meaning for them. So there are a number of results from this, but one I just want to take one in particular, which is this notion of the value of a grade. And again, this is sort of obviously moving into sort of some sort of quite fine level of insight, but I think the sense of what assessment means to learners, it can be quite fundamental in terms of how we design it, how we implement it, and at what point we use different types of assessment within that learning journey. So this is going back to understanding the learner experience and what this and what assessment means within that experience. So we asked some of those we interviewed for reasons why they maybe got a lower grade, because if one was looking at this from the outside, was just looking at a data set and was looking down that data set and found some learners who got a low grade in a particular assignment or in a particular module, one might say, oh, that person's got a lower mark than last year. They're not doing so well, or maybe they're struggling. But what we found was quite often that there were other reasons for a learner not doing as well. Obviously, struggling is one of them, but sometimes learners have decided that they because they're distance learners, because they're often working, because they've got a lot of other things going on in their life, they just had reprioritized. They decided they couldn't spend as much time, so maybe they had gone down from getting maybe 80% to 70%, for example. Or that they decided to focus on particular things in some modules that were relevant to them, but that were maybe not included as essentially in the assessment. Often learners will comment that maybe that they got a slightly lower grade because the module didn't directly build on the last, and that could be because the module itself didn't fit that qualification quite so well. But we also have a lot of learners who are studying what we call open degrees, where they can choose the modules themselves and the order in which they study those modules. So clearly, when one has that choice, if you move from chemistry to a humanities module or whatever, you will not necessarily directly build on that, so your marks might suffer as well. So there's a very complex picture here in terms of the learner's experience of assessment, which again, as I said, I touched upon earlier. And I think what this means is that we can say that the meaning that the learner gives to assessment can change. We're only still beginning to understand what this looks like for distance learners at the OU, and hopefully maybe this will spark some interest or some thoughts in terms of how you might be able to investigate how perceptions of assessment change with your learners too. I did also want to talk a little bit about the verification of identity, but for purposes of time, I will skip on from that. But I did just want to mention that the university has been involved in a European project which has been investigating and piloting software that offers a variety of different types of verification check. So, for example, facial recognition, voice recognition, keystroke analysis, plagiarism, and writing style. So that project, which is now just coming to an end, was very useful, and I think indicates that there is a movement in this area in the field. I think it's still in its infancy, but over time, the ability to be able to verify learners' identity a little bit more easily online will become easier, and that in itself will open up new opportunities for assessment. For example, as I mentioned earlier, at present we have to bring all our students into examination halls. There, of course, is that potential of students being able to take examinations from home, or being able to do examinations differently, or being able to do more practice-based examinations or smaller pieces of assessment throughout the course rather than just one big piece at the end. So that's an interesting area to keep an eye on. But I did want to conclude with digital badges, which I believe was part of the original forecast advertised title. So thank you for staying with me so far in that respect. And hopefully, a lot of what I've been saying already is building up to this point, because digital badges is a concept that's been around now for about 7 or 8 years. The Mozilla Foundation, back in 2012, 2013, developed the Open Badge Standard, which is used pretty much now by most of the major platforms that do allow teachers and individuals to issue digital badges, open digital badges. And there's been a lot of work, predominantly in the US and some in Europe, around how digital badges can be used for motivating learners, for providing credit for learners, and just as a slightly different way of thinking about assessment, both in terms of how you design assessment, what are you trying to assess, but also the level of an assessment, because digital badges do potentially allow you to offer more fine-grained micro credentialing of achievements. So they are maybe a more granular level to other forms of assessment. And what I'm involved with at the moment over the next year is a project in India, where we're going to be exploring the potential use of digital badges in teacher education, working with a couple of states. That's just starting up now, but a really interesting piece of work with a lot of promise, because of course badges in education are conceived as potentially of having a really big impact. This quote here is from back in 2013, when Mozilla launched the Open Standard, saying a badge is a digital credential that represents skills, interests, and achievements earned by an individual through specific projects, programs, courses, or other activities. And the role of a digital badge, well, some of the roles of a digital badges, according to Gibson, are to bring transparency to the learning, so learners can see what the badges are, they can see what they need to do to achieve those badges. The badges reveal meaningful detail about the learning to all stakeholders. So this means that teachers, learners, and employers can all see that detail. It provides an open mechanism for recognition of skills. Badges can help link stakeholders to the shared meaning, so linking teachers with learners, and also linking employers with learners, so linking together in the shared meaning. And there's also a potential for badges to play a role in the recognition of prior learning, or types of learning that maybe will be harder to assess. So what I wanted to do, if we'd had a larger cohort listening, was to invite a few thoughts about how badges are distinct from other forms of digital credentialing, such as certificates or digital trophies. So maybe if you're listening back to this, maybe just pause for a minute or two and think about that question. Think about what your current experiences or past experiences have been about badges, and how a digital badges used in education might be useful for you. So to give a quick example of how this works, this is an example, a worked example from one of the pieces of what we've been doing in India. But generally speaking, there's a whole series of different platforms that allow you to offer and award badges. You have to create a graphic, which you can see over here we've done on the left-hand side, and usually you have to set a description of what that badge is and the criteria that a learner has to meet to be awarded that badge. There's then a process, which can vary, but usually still remains relatively manual, of someone needing to determine whether the learner has achieved that badge, and if so, and they have awarding credentials, they can then click on award badge and award that to one learner, or award that en bloc to a whole number of learners. What the learner will see will be usually a number of boxes where they can either upload or insert the required evidence for proving or demonstrating that they qualify for that badge. That will depend on the type of criteria which have been specified and set. So that might be a piece of reflective work, or it might be a link, or combination of those. And then what does a learner do with this? Well, there's this concept of a backpack or backpacks where learners can bring these badges together. They can also be shared on social media. So there's a whole series of plugin now, and so I think there's been far more research looking at how badges have been issued and been set up, possibly a little bit less in terms of how learners use these backpacks. But the idea is that these badges are accumulated and can be used by the learner to demonstrate learning to others, whether those others are their teachers or employers. So a lot of things to think about, a lot of benefits. So for the student, it can help accreditate learning, it can strengthen motivation, it can provide deeper learning experiences, it can build confidence, it helps them to demonstrate commitment and improves the ability to manage and to create. So these all proposed benefits, which are to a lesser or greater extent have been investigated in research and are ongoing investigations. For the issuer, that is from the university's point of view, there's also a number of potential benefits to thinking about digital badges. So these might be a solution to issues around motivation. If particular groups don't appear to be as motivated, could digital badges be helpful? There's evidence on both sides in terms of what type of learners are more motivated by this technique than others. It can help track students' learning, because one of the great things about receiving a badge is the fact that you can then see who's received the badges. So going back to the analytics, that can be useful for monitoring learner progress. It can contribute to quality assurance. It could be potentially a low-cost, low-effort option, although that obviously massively depends on how one decides to implement that. But there's also a degree for the teacher of pedagogic creativity and effective scaffolding. And one of the most interesting and challenging things about badges is how to design the badge structure. So to decide what to award a badge for and how you're going to do it. And that process in itself can be quite creative and can be quite challenging for educators. It can also, of course, bolster the image and profile of the issuing university or institution. And it helps maintain that sort of sense of authority and status in the online and potentially even quasi-informal learning field. So an example of badges that we used a couple of years ago now in one of our MOOCs, MOOC being a massive open online course, so a course that's open for anybody to participate wherever they are in the world. We had a whole series of different badges which were focused and looking at quite different things. So we had one type of badge which was really rewarding progress, and this is shown in the top left. It was type 1. So the arrow between these two green circles represents kind of like the learning arc, if you like, is what we called it, or the learning pathway. So these rewards happen on that learning arc at particular points. Secondly, what we wanted to do was to reward cumulative efforts within those. So that's shown in type 2. But the third thing, and this is potentially the most interesting, I think, is rewarding learners for things that you don't necessarily expect that they have to do, which aren't compulsory, but are valued or thought worthwhile. So, for example, extracurricular work, work experience, additional support to other learners, those kinds of things that sort of fit outside the very the more narrow expectation about what content or subject material needs to be learned, but are graduate attributes or workplace practices which would be good to encourage learners to participate in. So we see a whole load of comments from learners, many positive, some a little bit more cautious. But here are just a couple of the more positive ones, at least just to give you, maybe this might spark some ideas in terms of thinking about how a digital badge might be useful for badges for a particular course. For example, one learner said, "Well, they make me smile. It's a good thing. Learning should be fun." And I think it was a fun element of the course. Another talks about time and motivation. So they were relatively limited in terms of the time that they had to do all the activities that were required for the module that week. So being shown what badges were on offer, which clearly were linked to the more important parts of the course, helped them to determine where the priorities should be. Another mentions it's symbolic, it's a personal reward. So this very much is talking about intrinsic motivation. Even though they don't show the badges to anybody else, it gives them a sense of progressing and moving forward. The fifth point here, I'm proud of them because I like the course, fits in with that point that I made about tying the learner to the institution, about building this relationship between stakeholders, between the learner and the institution that's teaching them. And finally, the fifth one, I decided they might be useful as evidence, professional development. I'm not sure if they will or not, but at least I have them. So what I've tried to do and hopefully present to you this morning has been some examples of the way in which the university is trying to think about assessment and trying to work to identify what we need to improve in assessment, how we can get better perspectives on the learner's experience of assessment, how we can use analytics to help us in that process and to help us to identify where support is required and help us to identify potentially struggling students. And to give an example of the kinds of learning technologies that are still emerging and how we're trying to think about how they can work in an online and a distance context. So on the screen now is my email address and the URL of my web page where you can find information both on some of the work that I've been doing at the moment and within the publications tab on their references and links to most of the content that I've presented today. So if you want to follow up on any of these particular elements of that, there's those links to publications there, which you may find very useful. Otherwise, do just drop me an email, and I'm always very interested to hear about your experiences and how you're dealing and managing assessment within your institutions. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you this morning, and I'll now sign off and hope you have an enjoyable rest of the day.